Hello and welcome back to Practical Inclusion. Apologies to those who tried to tune in last time. We had some technical issues, but we've got a new guest and a new topic today, and really thankful for those of you who were watching in either live or on the replay. I want to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people this time. I'm not on Wadawurrung country where I usually stream in from. But definitely want to pay my respects to elders past and present, and a really big call out to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are watching today, either live or through the replay. I'm very excited for the guest that I have today, and it's a topic that is right in the whole purpose behind Bree Gorman Consulting, but also quite outside it as well. I often talk about from the advice that I've received over the years from First Nations people and from diversity, equity and inclusion consultants, that reconciliation and inclusion of First Nations people in workplaces actually does and should sit outside our DEI work. It has a different level of priority. There should be direct lines of communication to CEOs. It shouldn't be buried within diversity, equity and inclusion plans. So always kind of acknowledge that up front. This is not my area of expertise. So it's really great to have somebody here today who can help us talk through some of the key, I guess, areas of consideration for organisations, but also with a particular bent around agriculture as well. But I've talked too much. Joshua, I'd love to get you to introduce yourself through story, as I do with all guests. Tell us a little bit about yourself, the kind of topic we will talk about today, and your journey as to how you ended up doing this type of work that you're doing.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Bree, and good day, everyone. So yeah, I just want to start by acknowledging country. I'm on Worimi country, which is home for me. This is where my dad's ancestors have, been for 60,000 years, and where is definitely home and where I feel most comfortable, I guess, in this place. So I want to just acknowledge my elders past and present and really thank them for their efforts and work to getting society, I guess, to where it is today, and our involvement in these kind of discussions and conversations as to where where we are and where that kind of future goal is. So I'm really quite humbled, I think, by the fact that I'm able to live and work on country. And I really enjoy the ability to connect with my community here and on broader Worimi country. So yeah, I just want to make sure I acknowledge country, pay my deepest respects to my elders here and across all the lands that you're joining from as well. So I have this interesting story with agriculture, and it's something I think that really comes to mind whenever I think about the way in which society has kind of moved to where it is. My family on these lands, on Worimi country, go back to the Bug family. It's quite a big family in this area, and my dad's, this is my dad's family, and I often talk about my dad's side of the family more than my mum's because it's something I'm more familiar with. But my mum's Aboriginal family is quite interesting as well. But I do just talk about my dad's side because I know it better. But yeah, so my family clashed with what we know as Western agriculture now back in 1820, in the 1820s, when a large agricultural company basically got gifted 1 million acres of Worimi country to start feeding the colony and also start looking at exporting. And it's probably the first area. I mean, there's certainly agricultural endeavors and activities happening in Parramatta and, closer to the city of Sydney as it was starting to make sure it was feeding the local, local population. But this was kind of the first endeavor really that took a lot of foreign funding, a lot of, UK-based investors who are investing in this idea of agriculture in Australia. And it was the first time when I think that the colony really looked at how do we export this commodity that we can grow here. So it's really interesting having these agricultural roots in Worimi country. because it's often overlooked. It's often an area that isn't well associated with agriculture, and particularly not well associated when we think about agriculture today in its broader terms.
Oh, interesting.
And it's this story, I think, that I always connect with it. That's the more I research it, the more it's based on agency. That for some reason, when we think about Indigenous involvement within systems in those early kind of colonial days, we often think of the horrific acts, and there were certainly many of those right across the country, and certainly here on Worimi country. That it's just a short distance over in the mountain range across from me, where our people were murdered for the fight for agricultural land, where we fought for the very right to be able to farm on these lands. But so too, and this is the bit that I think is often overlooked, so too did we have agency over our people had agency over our ability to work within these systems, that we learnt to adapt and looked at this Western economy that was slowly being developed and said, well, actually, we can do this as well, and started playing in with that. And this is the kind of interesting work that Paul Irish has done down in Sydney around Indigenous fishermen selling their fish to the colony as they started to engage in that economy, and it certainly happened up here on Worimi country, where our people started being involved in agriculture and Western agriculture and what that meant. And that's really the story I try and emphasize, that we as people here on Worimi country have been involved purposefully in this system since the 1820s. So when my dad's Indigenous family clashed with the white shepherds that were coming up on these lands, there was a choice there that Charlotte Derby, who later became Charlotte Bug, made around staying and looking after this shepherd that they had just raided all the sheep and killed all the sheep of his, and it injured him in that kind of process. But there was a choice that she made to stay and look after him, and they ended up falling in love, which I think is just amazing. But that's the decision that she made around what our family's future has ended up being, that we have been involved in this agricultural system since this kind of connection and this debate really over land and who belongs here and what that looks like. So if I fast forward, a few hundred years, really, my family have always been involved in agriculture, and that's really transformed from that early period right up till now, mostly with beef and dairy farming in this area. And I think for me, agriculture has been this later in life, a decision I made in my 20s, I guess. It wasn't something that really naturally kind of fit the bill. When I was young, I always had this social justice lens around what I was doing and what I was trying to achieve, and that was taught to me when I was about 9, when my dad had a serious bike accident and broke his neck and ended up with a brain injury. And the guy who had hit him off his bike, he just flat out denied the fact that he was involved in the accident, and never kind of came forward around that, but had certainly told others kind of following the activity that he was involved. And for me, that rights based around what that justice would look like led me down a career around law, and thinking that was the way that I could kind of look at this process and ensure that the truth was heard. But yeah, in this funny turn, I found agriculture and ended up being quite involved in the sector. And really, I guess my process now is around bringing the truth-telling, those true stories from what happened, and also all the truths. I think that truth is just not one person's perspective, that it's multiple perspectives, and we need to see that from multiple lenses, and trying to bring all of that together to understand our industry and agriculture having a really quite horrific but meaningful role in the colonization of these lands and the way in which we are engaged in that. Looking at the way in which that's going to have to transform around as a sector that's so reliant upon land-based assets and we know that there's a growing Indigenous estate that at some stage we're going to have crossover around, what does Indigenous owned lands and agriculture look like in Australia going forward. And I've also been really lucky, I guess, to work more broadly in the diversity space around looking at mob's involvement in workplaces right across Australia. I was involved in a survey of over 1,000 Indigenous people and their experiences of work back a few years ago. And really, I guess, listening to and hearing mob tell their stories about racism and seeing that as a major risk for organizations and something that really needs to be addressed. And that's certainly something I've experienced in my career as well, seeing some of those quite overt racist comments come to life, but also the covert that come up as well. So for me, I think it's interesting playing in this, that long spanning history around what truth telling looks like and how we can bring that forward to tell, the conversation that we need now for modernity, and how we weave that through today's social fabric for change.
Wow. Just in that time there, you've shared a number of stories with us in a way that I think has probably brought a lot of the listeners into a topic that perhaps we haven't thought about so much, in terms of that. I love the words that you used there, horrific and meaningful history and role around agriculture. And it's that dichotomy, isn't it, of the good and the bad, the hard and the easy, and as you talked about there, the truth telling. I'm interested in a number of things that you just raised then, and one of the things, and it's literally just a conversation I've had this morning with somebody who's a person of colour, who said to me that they were considering a role to work specifically on anti-racism in workplaces. And they have worked in diversity, equity, and inclusion for a while. And they said to me, it feels overwhelming. I don't know how we actually shift racism in Australian workplaces. It seems a harder task than perhaps in the other areas of inclusion that we focus on. And I'm interested in your experience and your thoughts, having done a lot of work in this space. Do you think we're making progress? Is this too hard? How do we kind of move forward?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of goodwill out there from organizations that want to do the right thing. And for me, it's around how we really utilize that to ensure that organizations do make fundamental shifts to support their Indigenous employees. And I think one thing that I'm really mindful of is that the yarns that I have are really specific around Indigenous people, and that their diversity is quite large, and that some of the issues that face mob in the workplace would also impact other diverse background people as well. So I just want to really clearly note that, because I think it's important. But I think there is a fundamental goodwill for people to have these conversations around mob. And the Gary Yalla survey that I was part of a few years ago was the first real nationwide showcase that racism was really in our workplaces and that something needed to be addressed. And we found that mob wanted to identify that nearly 80% of mob wanted to put up their hand and say, yes, I'm an Indigenous person and I'm proud of that, and that it was important for them to do that in their scope of work. But the impacts of that and the racism around that people felt around that was quite triggering. So, almost 30% of people worked in an organization that was probably, at least culturally unsafe, but I'm sure some of them were a lot worse. So really, I think fundamentally there's this work that needs to happen, and the organizations really need to look at how they engage with mob and what that looks like. And these are conversations that I think have often been caught up, and you mentioned earlier, Bree, around the impact of diversity and inclusion being really focused on a specific area, not really stepping out into that. It's that kind of, what are the early wins, I guess, and then looking at having this realization that, well, actually diversity is more than just these kind of few easy quick wins that we can have. It's this broader concept, and we need to consider this, and the nuances around each of the different aspects of diversity are all important. And then, there's also the interrelatability of those as well, and what the differences are there in the long term. So we know that organizations are keen to have these kind of conversations. Agriculture, the area that I work in most, I guess, is really delayed behind this. It's an area that the National Farmers Federation, which is the peak body representing our interests, see Indigenous people as a threat still in the industry almost. That their report and their roadmap to growing our industry almost sees Indigenous involvement as a sterilization of agriculture. That for some reason there's this competing aspects between Indigenous culture on one hand and agriculture on the other hand, and that there isn't this kind of relationship between them. But in fact, we know that relationship has been happening on these lands for 60,000 years. So just now, I think there's a turning point. I was involved in some yarns recently where agriculture was saying, well, what does diversity look like, and how does that broaden out beyond gender, which I think is exciting. But it is really early days. We know that there's quite a lot of issues to work through. But I think the bits that excite me, I guess, are the fact that we know Indigenous youth are the only growing youth cohort in Australia. That means we're going to have more and more mob entering the workforce, and that's fundamentally going to shift the role that we play and how we engage in work. We also know that that there's a lot of opportunities, that there are, I think, something like 1,800 organizations that have reconciliation action plans. And that's just the kind of tip of the iceberg, that there's so many more organizations and so many industries that are yet to have these conversations around reconciliation in their workplaces. And that will in turn have targets around employment and procurement from Indigenous people. And that's going to change fundamentally the power dynamic and the way in which organizations operate with mob right across the country. So that for me is a big turning point. And I think the other thing that I am seeing more is that workplaces are committing to this in a really practical way. So the work I'm involved with at Jumbunna, going and speaking to mob and surveying mob around what their workplace experiences are at a real, business-based level, that fundamental shift that they're starting to go, well, hang on, we need to do some work here, is really exciting.
It's so great to hear that that's occurring in the Indigenous space, as it is for in other areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion too. I'm interested in drawing out the RAP discussion a little bit, particularly around what you see for those who are listening in, who perhaps work in organisations that don't have RAPs at this stage or are considering it. What do you think? What are some of the key things that makes a RAP actually meaningful, and what can kind of derail people, I suppose, in achieving the intentions that they have?
Yeah, for me, a RAP is really a fundamental strategy that's specific around, Indigenous involvement and reconciliation within the workplace. It really is a choice and a pathway around what that is going to look like at an organizational level, and for me, it's important. It's always read with a strategy document, because it really is a strategy around what does Indigenous inclusion look like and how we're going to implement it within our workplace. So when those documents sit side by side, they should tell the novel of not only the organization, but what does reconciliation look like. And it needs to be given that weight around, it's not just a box ticking exercise. It really is fundamentally a plan to incorporate mob and reconciliation into your workplace. So for me, that's really exciting, because it fundamentally changes the way the organization has to operate, because it's then accountable to Reconciliation Australia, which is an organization that has in the past taken away organizations' levels around what level they might be at based on the work that they've done because of ill practice. And it holds people accountable around what that engagement should look like. So I think for me, it's a really good pathway. It also provides a structure for organizations to follow when they feel a bit lost in this space. But it's not the end goal. Like, getting a reconciliation action plan signed off by Reconciliation Australia is not the win. The win is the actual inclusion that happens after that. So, yeah, in that agricultural space, there are very limited reconciliation action plans. I think probably you can count them on one hand pretty comfortably.
Wow.
And we've got organizations who have just had them signed off who don't have any Indigenous employees, for instance. So, the goal of having a RAP is great. It does provide that structure, but it's definitely not the end. And it's actually how the mob get involved after that, post that kind of sign off, that is really exciting and where I think the most change happens.
It's fascinating that there's such a low uptake by agricultural businesses doing RAPs, considering you think that connection is probably more strong in that industry than perhaps in some other ones where there is more action.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting industry because it's, the relationship between Indigenous people and farmers is really kind of, it's very different depending on where you are, and the history that's involved there is very different. So it's an industry that's where Indigenous people have had to fight for the right of, getting land back through the decision and having rights back on land. It's where we've had to fight to get equal wages. It's where we've had to strike and have action to try and have equal rights and get treated fairly within the industry. And yet, despite the transformation that those rights have given us, we now have an industry where 55 to 60% of Australia's landmass is now, has Indigenous rights over it. That's expected to grow by 15% under Closing the Gap. So if you say 3/4 of Australia is going to then now have Indigenous rights over it again, and you have an agricultural industry that takes up 55% of Australia's landmass, there's going to be some crossover, and there's going to have to be some forced relationships around what that looks like, because it's only together will we be able to continue feeding our population here and exporting food overseas. And only together can we get the best out of the land, and working with the land, understanding that climate change is happening, and that we need to have a workforce to do that. So it's a really interesting nexus that I think agriculture finds itself in.
Yeah, it sounds it. It's like this kind of, again, a forced partnership, but as you say, with a really clear objective, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. I just wanted to, you've mentioned power a couple of times, and it's certainly been a thread through some of the work I've been doing over the last few weeks, particularly around power dynamics within organisations and how identity drives them, and how we specifically address that in our diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Because I certainly know that it's a harder thing to take control of. As you said, there's some quite easy actions that we can take to create more inclusive workspaces, but that power bit is really hard to overcome. Can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Yeah, it's something I think about at a range of different times, and it's really interesting when you work with organizations to understand who you're dealing with and who's feeding these kind of opportunities to come into workplaces to have these conversations. I often think, the better workplaces that I see have had really proactive leadership in this space, and are the ones that are knocking on the door saying, I don't know what we've got, but we do need to really address this. Or, I've heard from mob that things aren't right and we need to just get on with this and really kind of chart that leadership journey internally. And that's a very different conversation than mob getting frustrated, leaving organizations, and then speaking to other mobs saying, hey, listen, like, this place is pretty terrible, and then trying to get things built from the bottom up. It's just such a slow burn. So yeah, the organizations that are doing it really well are those that have got really strong leadership, and who have probably really great Indigenous leadership, or have certainly carved out the space for Indigenous people to self-determine what that looks like and what that process should be. So power is a really interesting nexus, I think, around how things change and what that process of change looks like, and how you can slowly, I guess, chip away at, institutions that are built around this kind of us and them. When we can work together and get the most out of diversity is when we have that really broad perspective of just coming together and getting things done, rather than having those different dichotomies. So yeah, it's a process, and I think there is a lot of opportunities that come through good leadership around this space. But yeah, it's certainly a journey that I think a lot of organisations will struggle with, and do struggle with, and particularly large historic organisations. So the agricultural company I talked about in my introduction, around those that got gifted this 1,000,000 acres, are finding themselves in this really interesting predicament where they're about to celebrate 200 years of business success, but have these really traumatic and fundamentally difficult relationships with mob back on this country, where they don't work with anymore. And it's a really hard conversation to have at an organization level, where there's so much community pressure around what our industry should look like. And that social accountability that I think all industries are starting to develop. So yeah, it's just an interesting time, and I think those that have good leadership in this space are going to really drive the national agenda forward, but also really benefit from having great diversity in general.
Yeah, I would totally have to agree with that, from my perspective too, in terms of that having that genuine support from leadership, and not just kind of responding to some noise that's being made. It makes a real difference in terms of avoiding that box ticking exercise that you alluded to beforehand, for sure. Well, we're done with time. I really enjoyed that conversation, and hopefully we'll get you back again sometime to explore some other topics. Where can people find you and hear more about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I think anywhere on social media, I hang out there a bit. So feel free to reach out and have a yarn. And also, like, I genuinely mean, let's have a yarn. I always offer the ability for somebody to reach out and have a chat, even if it is just a chat for the sake of having a chat. I think where we can all work together and hear from each other and have that relatability is an important step in the journey. So yeah, I really mean that I encourage people to have a chat, and I always follow up and make sure I do it. So yeah, certainly reach out if you're interested. There's a whole heap of work happening in this space, which is really exciting. And I think the other thing I'd just point people to is our Gary Yalla Indigenous survey around racism and work. And if you just research Gary Yalla, it comes up on the Diversity Council of Australia website, and there's access to our report and our findings there.
Fantastic. I'll definitely be looking that up. I've already noted that down when you mentioned it earlier. Awesome. Thank you so much, Joshua. Thanks, everybody, for listening in. And as always, if you've got topics or guests that you would like me to feature on this show, please absolutely send them through to me. It's always quite a challenge continually finding new people to come on and chat, and there's so many amazing people that we really want to hear from and give space to on this platform. So please send your ideas and suggestions through, and we'll catch you all next time. Thanks a lot, Joshua.
Thanks.
Sure.